Part 3, read by Keren Margetts. Chapter 7. Christmas looked over the battlefield, trying to distinguish Native Americans from the blue-coated Americans. Reds, whites, and black war-painted skins dispersed amongst the wave of blue. To Christmas, the image before him portrayed that of a roaring tempest, ever shifting. He waded through the sea of bodies, faces he did not recognize, thank God. Mark and Antistia had been seen within the thick of the charge before Christmas had lost sight of them. Frank had gone down instantly. Christmas did not know whether he was alive or dead.
"Frank!"
he screamed. Responses came from the fallen around him, a mix of both sides. In the most serious cases he would help them, offering bandages or last rites to those who could not be saved. An increasing feeling of desperation overcame him. Another body, another death, another stranger, and no sign of his friends. Nearby, a horse kicked and screamed, blood gushing from many wounds on its body. Christmas approached it slowly and cradled the muzzle, stroking it lightly, trying to soothe the animal. It died in his arms. This was not war. This was hell. Another horse trotted around nearby, minor wounds to its left side. Its rider long since gone, long since dead. Christmas walked to it and mounted the animal, giving him a better view of the hellish landscape before him. Still no sign of Frankie, just more dead and wounded.
"Frank, can you hear me?"
A voice far to his right weakly retorted.
"Yes. Help me out, will you?"
Christmas drove his steed on as fast as he could allow, minding the bodies surrounding them. The battle raged on 50 feet away. He came close to Frank, who was lying in the dirt propped up on his elbows.
"Stay still so I can look at the wound."
Christmas said, looking at the gash on Frank's forehead.
"It looks like you have a mild concussion. Are you feeling well?"
"What do you think? I'll be fine. Just help me get up and we can start looking for the others."
"Just let me bandage."
"No point. Save for those who need them."
Without another word, Frank surged once more towards the depth of the battle, staggering slightly. Christmas hesitated, deciding finally to let the horse go. He could not let another suffer such pain. With a sigh, Christmas then followed Frank into this unfamiliar environment of warfare. Chaos had surrounded Mark and Tia rapidly after the initial charge. Volleys of musket rounds had peppered the natives, their bodies littering the battleground. Mark cast glance towards Tia whenever he could afford to, ensuring she was safe behind him. They were stood, back to back as the melee had descended upon them. Annoyingly, Mark had to shoulder his anchor, lest he hit any friendly troops. Opting to use his saber in its place, he was relatively skilled at fencing, allowed him to block enemy bayonets and maneuver the needle tip into their hearts. Tia was holding her own, waiting for the enemy to charge, before sidestepping the blow, stabbing them repeatedly once they left an opening. The feeling of her back against Mark's returned on every kill she made. Bullets whizzed through the air, their screams erupting from rifled barrels. One or two barely skimmed Mark's head, tearing holes into his lovely hat. Mark dispatched another foe, and looked about him for oncoming threats. A native sat on top of a struggling American soldier, hitting him again and again with a crude war axe. A bloody sight. Just beyond him a soldier was reloading his musket rifle, hastily placing a percussion cap before pouring powder and shot down the barrel. He looked panicked, shaking as he did it, his intended target most likely being the native that was slicing his friend. Mark whipped out his pistol and shot the soldier.
"How be thee faring, Miss Tia?"
She grunted as she sank her blade into another man's chest.
"Well enough. How are you doing?"
she said, breathlessly.
"Fine indeed. It'd be too late to alter course now, anyway."
"Have you found Frank or Christmas yet?"
Nay, haven't seen neither hide nor hair of them.
One moment.
Tia replied, jumping forth towards an approaching soldier. A cannonball sailed through the air and landed a few feet to Mark's left, scattering the nearby soldiers and natives, the cold metal not distinguishing friend from foe. A brave officer approached Mark, clearly trembling a little before his imposing figure. Mark smiled and lunged towards him, sabre point first, striking the side of his opponent's blade. They countered and swirled their swords in an effort to disarm each other. Mark retreated a few steps, putting his weight forward. The officer moved to close the distance. Big mistake. Mark sprang forward, extending his sword arm. The blade pierced the man's abdomen within a few seconds. Mark turned to look at Tia, who was busy backpedaling away from a bayonet. He smiled. She was quite the fighter. The smile vanished. Beyond her stood another figure, holding a pistol. He was aiming for Tia. Mark tried to shout a warning, but the sound of battle around him drowned it out. Tia didn't even hear the shot. A hole tore itself into her stomach, shock blossoming across her face. Mark barely registered her falling. A great rage consumed him. Screaming his anger, he unfurled the anchor from his back and threw it straight at the shooter, letting go of the chain completely to ensure that it would reach. The shooter had seen it and fired a second and third shot at Mark, the bullets ripping through his neck and left eyeball. The pain was blinding, fatal. Mark's body hit the ground dumbly. As he blacked out, he saw the anchor make contact with a few soldiers before finally shattering the right leg and arm of the shooter. Tia was on the ground with him, tears making tracks down her eyes as they both perished. Frank pushed through the battle, his panic increasing as they searched. Christmas followed in his shadow, his arm holding a knife aloft reluctantly. After what Christmas had been through, Frank was not surprised. Part of him was thankful he was not alone in this. Suddenly, within the distance, there stood Mark and Tistia, fighting back to back. Frank roared their names, but over the sounds of gunshots and cannon fire, the two of them had no chance of hearing him. As him and Christmas began to run towards them, they were barricaded by charging horsemen, locked in combat. He tried to force his way between the horses. He could not duck under, nor press through them. The horses' hot breath and the screeching of blades directly above him.
Antistia!
Christmas shouted, helplessly trying to get through the colliding bodies of the horses. Frank raised his pistol, resilient to take his kinsman's life, nor wanting to betray the trust of the Indians. His fingers tightened on the trigger. Christmas nudged his arm. The bullet fired skywards. The horses reared at the sudden sound, dismantling their riders. In the brief gap, Frank and Christmas darted forwards, only to see a bullet pierce Antistia's lower back. She crumpled into the ground. Mark slung his anchor towards the young shooter, crippling him. Before the shooter fell, 2 bullets were fired towards the pirates, hammering into his neck and eye. Christmas sprinted towards the casualties, yelling their names. Frank did not follow, caught by a grim reality. The shooter was a picture image of only one man he knew, his father. Frank turned to see Christmas with Mark, slowly closing his eyelids and muttering words to him which Frank could not hear. Christmas then turned to Antistia, rolling her so that he cradled her in his arms. As Frank watched, he saw her hand fall from where it was clutching Christmas's arm. Christmas looked up, his bloodshot eyes searching for Frank, but Frank could not stay. He had to save his father. If he died here, Frank would not exist. The sound of battle was silenced around him as he held her, a 17-year-old girl with a whole life ahead of her, gasping for her last breaths. Christmas brushed Antistia's hair from her face, as he had done the time he found her, and her blue eyes looked up at him. Her head was heavy, and he readjusted his arm. Her dreamy eyes caught him again.
It's all going to be okay. Everything is going to be okay.
He said, a tear creeping under his eye. Christmas placed his hand on the open wound of her stomach and pressed. Wet blood oozed through his fingers. He could feel it dripping from her back too, sticky and warm between his legs. Antistia moved her hand to meet his.
It's okay. I've died before, remember?
She attempted a smile, and a tear of blood trickled from her lips. She clutched his arm as she coughed a mouthful of blood onto his shirt, and then she was gone. Christmas felt her chest drop into his lap, and her hand fell into the pool of Mark's blood. He followed the final gaze of her eyes to the sun that forced its way through the clouds. He looked around, but he could no longer see Frank. Chapter 8. Christmas sat on a patch of grass beneath the shade of a tree. His cheeks felt burnt, and he could feel the blisters creeping up his soles. His clothes were rags about him. He looked down at his knees. They were black. Dirt seeped into his cuts, and blood stained the hairs on his legs. Not his blood. His arms still shook from her weight, from her cold touch against his skin. The ground was freshly dug before him. That is where 2 graves lay, amongst dozens. Christmas crawled towards them. He had headed both with a twiggy cross, and laid flowers on hers and the anchor on the other.
Father, I do not understand. Why was I brought here to see death? Why were we all brought here, if death seems the only escape? Show me what you want me to do, Father.
Christmas rubbed his watering eye and clambered to his feet. He was glad that up here the sweet smell of the tree would mask the sickening smell of bodies, that they could lay in peace. Footsteps were coming from behind, running fast. Christmas heard the panting breath of Frank and turned.
Christmas! Christmas, you have to help me! My father is dying.
What? Your father?
Yes, my father. He's here. In battle.
Christmas wanted to ask more, but Frank was already running in the opposite direction, so he sprinted after him. They entered a ditch in a clearing. A body of a boy lay before them, probably not even in his 20s, yet still fighting in a skirmish as bloody as this. On his right side, his limbs hung shattered. His body was twisted unnaturally. The bone of his broken wrist burst through his skin, and his calf muscle hung limply detached from his leg. The face was white with unconsciousness. Christmas registered the person still to be alive by the faint rise and fall of the body's rib cage.
Quick, we need to stop the bleeding.
Frank said urgently. Christmas tore the sleeves from his shirt and knelt beside the frail body. He searched his pockets, finding the needle kit his wife had packed before their journey across Wales. He lifted the decimated leg and hurriedly began to thread the needle through the tough, wet flesh. Bile burnt in the back of his throat at the sight of it, and Christmas's stomach churned. Cramp began to emerge within his fingers as he constantly fought to pierce the skin with the needle. With the final stitch, Frank readily bound the strips of cotton, sealing the wound. Blood instantly coloured the white material. Christmas held his head for a moment, as he felt a sense of lightheadedness. They both then turned their attention to the wrist. Green pus and blood covered the bone.
Give me your flask.
Christmas muttered, covering his mouth and nose in attempt not to be sick. Frank fumbled through his pocket and handed Christmas the small carton. The pastor poured the alcoholic liquid over the wrist in an effort to wash away the debris. The bone soon became visible to them. He could no longer think straight.
I cannot help him with this, and the leg is unlikely to hold.
Christmas muttered.
He needs a surgeon.
Stop!
Frank and Christmas stopped before the men with muskets. Frank's father hung limply between them, fading in and out of consciousness as they supported him by the arms.
Please, you need to help him.
said Frank, breathlessly. The guard before him recognized the man between and gestured 2 soldiers to help.
What business is he of yours?
The guard asked them, not lowering his weapon as the 2 other Americans supported Frank's father into the camp.
That doesn't matter,
muttered Frank, watching as they helped his father onto a stretcher and carried him past tents.
Please, may you go with him. He'll be no harm.
How do I know you're not working for them?
The soldier gestured beyond the battlefield to where the Native Americans were camping.
If I was, what would it matter? I'm just one person in the camp of dozens. If I seem to be a threat, I won't be hard to take down, will I?
The soldier rubbed his chin between his fingers, thinking this over. Frank was becoming agitated. He would soon lose sight of where his father went.
Why are you so concerned?
He treated his wounds.
Christmas quickly said.
He needs to know if we'll make it.
You're a surgeon?
The soldier's face suddenly looking hopeful.
Yes, he is.
Christmas quickly lied, in hope for Frank to be with his father.
A skilled physician.
The guard eyed him one last time before nodding.
Go in and follow. Help where you can.
Thanks,
muttered Frank, rushing past the guard and running towards his father. The rest of the day was spent with him working alongside the army physicians, attempting to do what they could to heal his father's wounds. Finally, as the night began to draw in, they sat back, knowing they had just managed to save a life. His father stirred next to him. Frank sat quietly watching the features on his face, all still recognizable even as a teenager. Brown eyes which seemed ever so welcoming, a large crooked nose which Frank had always teased him about, and the dark spot of hair amongst his light blonde. It had been years since he had seen his father leave, and when they had received the telegram, Frank had wished for nothing more than to talk to him one last time. How blessed was he to be able to experience this moment, which all families would treasure.
What time is it?
He groaned from the stretcher.
almost midnight.
Frank croaked, coughing to try and remove the lump in his throat. His voice was virtually the same. His father raised his uninjured arm and rubbed his eyes tiredly. As he did, Frank noticed the glint of a barrel of a gun tucked into his belt. He glanced down at his own waist, to see the exact same pistol held in his hostel.
I was dying. Alone. What happened?
You were wounded.
I can tell that.
Frank briefly retold the events.
You saved my life.
He asked. Frank nodded in response.
But I do not know you. Or do I? Your face. There's something about it.
Frank did not respond.
You'll be fine.
I doubt I'll ever walk again properly.
Chuckled his father darkly, looking down at his leg.
But I'm alive. That's a gift enough.
There was a silence between them. Frank had little time remaining, but had so many questions, so many things to say, yet most of which would make no sense to the man before him, who was even younger than Frank himself. It still made Frank's head hurt when he thought about it.
I never wanted to be here. He forced me to go. Guess it's his way.
Who forced you?
Frank asked, face creasing in confusion.
Jimmy. A friend. Well, was a friend. I saw those Indians drag him away, so God knows what they've done to him. I'm not even sure if I care, but damn, I should have said no.
Never once did his father raise his voice. Anger was clear in his wide eyes, but never did he project it across in this tone, a remark as calm as if he were commenting on the weather.
There's this girl. Italian. Back home in Brooklyn. I could have never seen her again if that anger had hit me fully. I'm gonna get away as soon as I can and see her again. Claudia Castell.
He now beamed fully at the sound of the girl's name. Frank's mother. His father carried on talking, but a realization suddenly came to Frank. Jimmy, also in the battle here, had been captured. He did not dare to think how it may affect the future if Jimmy was to die here. He had to move, and fast. Frank stood. He had lingered too long with his father. His father was safe, and that was all that mattered. Now, as much as it pained him, he had to save Jimmy.
What is your name? I should thank you at least.
His father called as Frank began to move away. Frank paused at the door, his hand hovering in mid-air as he prepared to pull apart the flaps of the curtain. He breathed in deeply before turning to face his father for what would be the last time.
My name is Frank.
Frank.
His father smiled, the boyish grin which had always cheered Frank up as a child.
I will always cherish thy name as long as I live. Thank you.
He smiled in response to his father's last words to him before forcing himself from the tent. Frank knew what those words would mean in 20 years' time, when Robert Douglas would remind himself of the man who saved him in battle when he held his newborn son in his arms for the first time. Chapter 9. Smoke was rising from the camp up ahead, clashing against the bright blue sky. The pair crossed the signed plains without facing any disturbance, both the native and American camps trusting them equally. No bodies remained on the battlefield, all having been returned to their elected sides for burial or family. The native American camp was silent. The remains of families gathered around the tents. Frank did not dare attempt a head count at how many had survived the battle. The final horses were all tied around the same post. It was a shocking sight to see that merely 5 remained. Frank and Christmas marched through the camp, heading to Black Kettle's tent. He was sat outside it, comforting and tending to the wounded. His wife stood by his side, offering him fresh water and bandages. The chief looked up when he saw the two of them approach.
You're alive,
he muttered, managing a fleeting smile. He was not too badly injured, apart from a small gash visible on his head.
I feared the worst after the others fell.
Fine,
replied Frank quickly, knowing by the others he meant Antistia and Mark.
have you taken a prisoner?
Yes, just one. A threat to both sides.
What will you do to him?
He will receive the punishment any of his kind deserve.
Death?
asked Christmas. Black Kettle nodded.
Sure he has been enough already,
said Frank, starting to panic.
It will be a message to the Americans. This is what happens if they hurt us.
He gestured to the wounded.
Cannot risk another attack.
Snapped Frank.
You won't hold them back.
The chief looked back down, tending to an injured man.
Then that is our fate, Costello.
May I see him at least, please?
Pleaded Frank. Black Kettle nodded.
Do not be long.
Another native, at the chief's command, led them to the tent where Jimmy was being held hostage. He held the flap open for them, and Christmas and Frank entered. Jimmy was lying on the floor, his mouth gagged and his hands and feet bound. He noticed them enter in the brief light visible, until the flap closed and the dark environment returned. Frank bent down, just being able to make out the figure on the floor, and removed the cloth between his teeth.
Jimmy?
asked Frank, stepping away.
You're not Indians?
Grunted the man, his voice hoarse from the gag. Yet from it Frank knew it was indeed the man from his future.
No, we're not. We've come to let you go. Why?
Jimmy asked, instantly suspicious.
Does it matter?
Here.
Christmas said from the back of the tent.
No one stands guard this side. We can get him out of here.
Frank passed Christmas his knife, who then began to carve an exit through the buffalo skin, which covered the teepee. When a big enough opening was made, Frank picked up Jimmy and dragged him towards Christmas.
Say a word, and I'll make sure you never speak again. Agreed?
Snarled Frank, pressing his pistol against the skin of Jimmy's cheek.
Agreed.
He grunted in reply. Christmas moved forward, cutting away the binds that held Jimmy's ankles, and Frank pushed him to the ground and gestured him to crawl through.
Are we doing the right thing? He seems dishonest against Black Kettle.
I can't let him die,
Cried Frank.
as much as I'd like to.
Christmas had been right. There was no one standing at this end of the tent. They all crawled through the gap and stood up. Frank quickly checked around them. All was clear. They skirted quickly around the edges of the camp. No one took notice of them. Some briefly recognized either Christmas or Frank, but no one they passed seemed to have knowledge of Jimmy, so they did not stop them. Then there was a yell from behind them. They had noticed Jimmy's disappearance. They moved forward more quickly, half dragging their prisoner due to the binds around his wrists. As they reached the final tents of the camp, Jimmy fell face first to the ground.
Get up!
Remove the binds. I can't get anywhere without it.
No, you'll run!
Horns sounded from the native camp, and the galloping of hooves soon became obvious. Jimmy raised his arms towards Christmas, fear flitting across his eyes. They had no choice but to release him. Frank, standing guard in front of them, gun in hand and ready as he tried to determine which way the horses would come. Christmas knelt and cut the ropes as quickly as he could. The horses came into focus. Black Kettle rode at the front, face bright with anger. Jimmy sprang to his feet, knocking both Christmas and Frank aside. He turned and attempted to run towards the American camp, before tripping over the rocky terrain. Frank surged forward and forced him to stay on the ground.
Listen to me! Listen!
Frank yelled, trying to keep a struggling Jimmy still.
You go to your leader, and you make him call off the attack. Got it? Never. You're all dead.
He spat back. Frank pointed his pistol to the ground a few inches to the right of Jimmy's head, and fired into the ground, the shock causing Jimmy to jump and cover his ear from the sound. Frank moved the gun to his temple.
You will call off the attack!
Frank, they're coming!
Screamed Christmas, the hooves growing louder behind him. Frank fired the gun to the left of Jimmy's head, forcing him to respond. Jimmy screamed, covering both of his ears desperately.
Yes, I'll do it.
Jimmy shouted. Frank loosened his grip and let Jimmy get to his feet, watching as he began to sprint as fast as he could, tumbling a number of times towards the tents beyond. Frank turned to Christmas, and they watched together as the 5 horses surrounded them, spears and bows pointing. Black Kettle looked up to see Jimmy running, and from the anger upon his face, he must have realized that he was too close to enemy lines for them to follow in pursuit.
Why?
The chief simply asked.
It had to be done. For all our sakes, forgive us.
You betrayed us.
The 5 men on horses moved in, the blades of spears and the heads of arrows coming closer to their heads. This had to be the end for them, yet with it they hoped they had at least saved the natives from another attack here, and would not die in vain. Through a gap in the horses, Christmas could see Jimmy suddenly find himself behind the American line. It was up to fate now whether or not Jimmy would follow the word and help stop the fighting. Hopefully, they had achieved their purpose here. An almighty gust of wind hit them as if in answer, shocking the horsemen and their steeds as they struggled to stay still from the force, their weapons straying from their targets. Christmas and Frank meanwhile felt no disturbance. Instead, a feeling of complete weightlessness and distance, as if the wind was actually pushing them away. The light around them was beginning to dim rapidly. Frank tried to move his arms and legs, but found that he had no control over them. The faces of Christmas, Black Kettle, and his men were becoming unrecognizable and distorted. With the sound of a sudden crash, Frank felt himself moving at a frightening speed, as if he were airborne, but he could not see through the darkness that had soon swallowed him. Frank had only experienced this sensation once before, and that was when he had arrived here. They must be going home.